Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro GameCore. So look at this thing. It looks like it came straight out of the 1990s. It has these bright, absurd colors to it, LED lights that are completely unnecessary, monster-sized shoulder buttons, as well as a protruding case. As someone who obsesses about things like design and aesthetics, this is so offensive to me in many different ways. But somehow, despite all these weird and crazy design choices, I'm starting to fall in love with it. And I don't know why it's growing on me so much, but we're going to spend this video today kind of investigating all the things I feel about it. Everything from the ridiculous LED lighting, to these strange protrusions on the back of the device, which a Discord user by the name of Hijinks calls Hulk nipples, and I think that's like the most appropriate name ever, to just how it all comes together in the end and what that gaming experience is really going to be like. And from the get-go, I've never really considered myself a YouTuber who's trying to sell you something. Like, that's not ever my goal. What I really like to do with these videos is just kind of walk you through everything and give you the same experience that I have as I'm first reviewing a device, good or bad. And I think it's just kind of an easy win to just hate on this device because it is so ugly, and it does have a chipset that is aging. But I also think it's important to give credit where credit is due. Somebody worked really hard to get this to the market and into people's hands. And to me, that in itself is an accomplishment that warrants a 20 to 25 minute review video. So that's what we're going to do. Let's dive right in. So this device is the GameForce Chi, and it just recently came out and it sells for $95. It has the same RK3326 chipset that we find in devices like the RG351P and so on. What makes it unique is it's the first horizontal device that has a 4x3 display, which really makes it well suited for retro gaming. So here on the left you can see all of the games that this device can play easily. And this is the same as it is on any of the other similar devices. Anything basically up through PlayStation 1 is going to play just fine. Now on the right here, this is what I'm calling the gray box of disappointment. Some of the games on these systems here on the right side will play okay, but most won't. I would expect to say 25% of the games in these catalogs are going to play just fine, and about 50% of them are going to be somewhat playable. And those are the same odds as it is with any of the other RK3326 devices, but performance on this device is actually a little bit behind the others, and we'll get into that later. Okay, let's do a quick unboxing here. I bought this device directly from the designer, and I'll leave a non-affiliate link to their website down below. And as soon as you open it up, you start to see some of the personal touches on this device. Number one, it comes with its own case. And look at that, even the case has its own nipples. Like, how funny is that? Inside, you're going to find an instruction manual that's mostly in Chinese, but it has some English in there. A USB-C charging port, and a microfiber cloth. So moment of truth here, I actually went with the green device. And there's an orange one as well as one that they're calling Desert Tan. But honestly, the green one was like the most garish and like offensive to me, and so that's why I decided to go for it. I don't have any other solid green devices like this, and it really stands out. And right off the bat, these Hulk nipple things are the first thing that stood out to me. They're just so unique. And the idea here is that it's supposed to rest in between your index and middle fingers. And sure enough, they do. They actually fit really well here. I'm not sure if they're absolutely necessary, but they are a nice added feature. Okay, let's look at the buttons for a bit. We'll start with the D-pad. One thing you may not notice here right off the bat is that the D-pad and the face buttons are all kind of in an indentation, so there's a little bit of a semicircle within this part here, much like how it is on a PS Vita. I think the D-pad has the right amount of travel to it, and it feels a little bit stiff in a good way. It's still definitely a mushy D-pad, but it's great. Analog sticks here are kind of wobbly, and they don't push down, so they're not clickable. And I have a feeling that underneath these little grips here, you're going to find that same cheapo analog stick that you find on the Odroid Go Super and the original RGB10. Okay, let's talk face buttons. My first impression with these is that they stick out a lot and there's a lot of travel here. Like, the distance between not pushing and then pushing down the button is really significant, more than I would expect on most devices. I've seen a few reviewers complain about the amount of play or wobble in these buttons, and I will agree that they are pretty significant. And a lot of that has to do with how much these protrude from the case. I think when you push the button down head on, it's not so bad, but if you're pushing it down at any other angle, it's very significant. Now, button wobble isn't the end of the world. For example, many controllers have it. Here's a Super Nintendo controller, it has a bit of a wobble. Same thing with the PS1 controller. And the PSP controller has even more wobble. The difference between these is that they don't stick out much from the case, and so the wobble is not very significant. And I think that's where the GameForce Chi went wrong. If you look at something like the PS Vita, it has the same size buttons, and they also stick out quite a bit. But they have zero wobble, which makes them feel like very sturdy buttons. And even though something like the RGB 10 Max does have a good amount of wobble, it doesn't protrude a lot, and that's why it's not an issue on this controller, but it is on the GameForce. Overall, the amount of play in these buttons really gives it a kind of amateurish feel, which is really unfortunate for a device that actually feels very good. Overall, I'd say these buttons are actually pleasant to push down on. But again, they really only shine when you push down on them directly from the front. The start and select buttons, as well as the other function buttons on the left side, they have a good amount of travel, and they have very minor wobble to them. There's none of those issues that you have with the face button. On the bottom, you have a headphone jack, a USB-C port, and what looks to me like a reset button. On the top, you have a single SD card slot, as well as your power button, and then 4 big ol' shoulder buttons. And I've seen a few people give a negative review to these shoulder buttons, basically saying that they don't have enough travel to them. And I honestly disagree. I like the fact that they are kind of clicky, and you don't have to push them down too hard in order to work. To me, shoulder buttons have never been buttons that I accidentally press, and so this actually feels like the best amount of travel to me. They're just big and sturdy buttons, and to me that actually works really well during gameplay. And there is zero wobble to these. They are set very well in the case. And the chunkiness just really goes together with the aesthetics of this device altogether. Near the top here, you have 2 stereo speakers that are placed perfectly. None of your fingers are going to get in the way of these. And the elephant in the room is this GameForce Qi branding. And a lot of people are turned off by this, and honestly, I kind of don't like it either. But I understand where he was coming from that. He's basically mimicking the design choices of the Neo Geo Pocket and the Neo Geo Pocket Color. And so while this design choice is definitely not something that I would prefer, I respect the fact that they are trying to kind of just go all in with that nostalgia piece. And whether or not they pulled that off, it's really going to be up to you. Now, probably my biggest gripe about this device is that it doesn't have an OCA laminated display. So there's a piece of glass here, and then a space, and then the LCD panel. And it's probably a 2mm difference there. Now let's talk about overall design and how it kind of feels in the hands. It has these really sharp angles at points you can see here around the screen, and then here along the back as well. And I have 2 thoughts about this. Number 1, I like the fact that they made these kind of abrupt design choices. This feels very 90s to me, this idea that they actually just draw these lines in there and you're just going to have to deal with it. And number 2, I think they pulled it off. This is a very comfortable controller. When you place your fingers as they're supposed to be placed and you're playing a game, honestly, it's one of the more comfortable experiences that I've had with any of these handhelds. And sure, it's chunky and ugly, but it also works. Okay, let's do a size comparison here. Here's the RG351P. Now these devices have the same chipset inside, a different screen with the RG351P, and you can see that even though they are about the same length, the GameForce Qi is just significantly taller. I'd say about 20% taller. I think what ends up happening with that is that it feels less like a chocolate bar like it does with the RG351P. Instead, it's just more balanced in the hands. And that extra length allows you to cradle the corners of the device into the palm of your hands. It's a very natural feeling grip, and I think that if you have larger hands than mine, which are about medium sized, I think this device is still going to feel very comfortable. And last note here, this is easily the sturdiest plastic device that I own. It truly feels like locked in, like it's made out of one single piece of plastic that's just sturdy and solid. It's actually really impressive and makes a lot of the other plastic devices, even the RG351P, feel a little bit amateurish in its assembly. I can't emphasize enough how sturdy this device feels. Okay, let's check out weights here. So it's 213 grams. That's pretty heavy. The RG351P is 189 grams, and the RG351V is 230 grams. So it's about the weight of an RG351V. And I don't think it's an uncomfortable weight, especially given the fact that it's a horizontal device, because you're able to naturally balance the weight between your 2 hands. Now this device does not come with an SD card, and it doesn't have an operating system loaded on it. So you'll need to bring your own SD card, and this is actually a good thing, because it's a completely open source device, it's fully supported by EmuElec. And in order to keep this video at a reasonable length, I'm going to do a separate video here in the next day or 2 that's going to explain how to set up your GameForce with EmuElec, and some of the tips and tricks in order to get it working properly. I'll also do a teardown of the device in that video as well. So it'll be a setup and teardown video. Now, one of the most unique aspects of this device is the ability to adjust the LED lights that are inside of it. And all of these are built into the EmuElec settings, and it's kind of a neat novelty idea. And I don't know how you feel about LED lights. I think they're cool in some contexts. I'm not really sure if I'm ever going to use them on this device itself, but it's kind of awesome to have this option available and make your device look even uglier than it already does. Now you can see even in bright lighting conditions that these LED lights create a ton of light bleeding. So let's see what it looks like in the dark. First, let's turn off the lights with no LED lights on. And you can see there's already a little bit of light bleeding here on the bottom right. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but that's really the only light bleeding that I see on this device. which is pretty impressive being the fact that it's a light plastic color. Now when you turn on the LED lights, the red is always the darkest of the LEDs, and as you can see here, there's a pretty good amount of light bleeding. But if you turn it to any other color, it basically turns into a light show at that point. I'm not sure if I'm going to like or hate playing this thing in the dark. And to be honest, I really cannot tell if people are going to love this or hate it. And maybe that's because I personally am torn about it myself, but at the same time, I wanted you to see what it looked like here in the dark. As it stands, there's no other device like this, and that's a win, I guess. Now because this device already runs Emulec, you may already be familiar with the emulation station style front end that works in this device. It's much like what you would find in any of these other retro handheld devices from this generation, or from the Raspberry Pi running RetroPie. And this device has built-in Wi-Fi, so you can go in and you can download other themes, and then install them and then run them just like this. I will note that I noticed that some of these themes are really not optimized for this 4x3 display. Like they look like they want to be on a 3x2 or a 16x9 display, they're just a little bit squished. To adjust the volume, all you have to do is hold the home button and then press up and down. And I think that's the most intuitive hotkey combination they could have chosen. Now in terms of game performance, we'll go over that here in a minute, but I want to talk about the feel of the gameplay itself in your hands. And I'll tell you, the first minute I was actually playing this device, especially on a platformer like Mario 3, I thought to myself, we kind of have a problem here when it comes to the controls. Let me show you what I mean. So in something like Super Mario Bros. 3, you're typically going to hold down on one button while pushing the other button. And often you achieve this by holding on one side of your thumb and then flicking over to the other side of your thumb on the other button. But given the size of these buttons, the distance between them, and the amount of travel and wobble that these buttons have, it's not a very comfortable experience. The fact is, because of the height of the button and the amount of wobble, when you try to push your thumb towards it, often you end up pushing the button away instead of down. And that can be a really frustrating experience. Now as you can see with the RG351P, you don't have that problem at all, because your thumb just naturally rests against that A button. And so it's very easy to hold down B and then press A for jumps. And unfortunately it's not the case with the GameForce Qi. And often I would either miss that button altogether or I'd hit it late. And potentially you could get used to it over time, but in the few days of testing that I had with the device, I never actually adapted to it. So it ended up being a frustrating experience from the very beginning up until right now. Okay, still on the subject of negative things here, let's talk about the screen for a second. Like I mentioned before, there's a gap between that piece of glass and the LCD panel. And when you're viewing this device from anything but straight on, it's very apparent just how much it deadens the view. The colors aren't as vibrant, you get a lot of glare and reflections, and overall it just feels like a much cheaper experience, especially after you get used to playing something with an OCA laminated display. Now to be fair, all the original consoles, Game Boys and things like that, they had this glass panel as well. So in that sense, they're very true to the 90s roots, but I think this is something we should probably try to get away from here in the 21st century. But you know, to be honest, when you're playing it and looking straight at it, often your eyes won't notice it over time. So let's compare this display against the RG351V, which is the other device in this chipset that has a 4x3 display. Now on paper, these screens basically have the same specs. They're 3.5 inches, they have a 640 by 480 resolution. And in direct comparison between the two, you can see that the RG351V is a little bit warmer of a display. Its white balance is definitely more on the yellow side, but it also looks like the colors are more saturated and the blacks are darker. And it ends up looking super sharp across any angle. By contrast, the GameForce Qi only looks fairly good when you're looking at dead on the center. Now granted, this is a handheld device, you're mostly going to play it just looking at it straight on. But for me, once I saw the difference between the two, it's really hard to unsee it. And personally, I don't think I'm actually going to give it a negative mark for the fact that it doesn't have an OCA laminated display, but I do think that if it did have one of those displays, I would like it even more than I do already. Now, just because the RG351V has a better display, doesn't automatically make it a better device. For example, I'm not a huge fan of the shoulder buttons on this device, and it's a much more cramped experience because of its vertical orientation. So they each have their own trade-offs. The GameForce Qi is miles more comfortable to hold than the RG351V, but you do have to contend with that amount of button wobble, which is really affecting when you're playing something like a platformer or any other type of game that's going to require you to push two buttons at one time. That being said, the RG351V does not have that issue when it comes to pushing two buttons at once, but you do have to contend with the cramped feeling of using a vertical handheld. Okay, moving on to performance now. We're talking about Emulec 4.1 at this point, and performance is pretty good. It runs with a RetroArch backend for the most part, And while some of these emulators are not quite optimized for this chipset, they still run really well. You're not going to have any issues playing any Super Nintendo game, or Sega Genesis for that matter. Same thing with handheld systems like the Game Boy Color, things like that. And some of the bezels that were created for the RG351V will also work for this device because it's also a 4x3 display. So if you're interested in adding any bezels to your handheld devices, check out my handheld settings guide, which I'll have linked in the video description. Now, I've never been one to play the Neo Geo Pocket or the Neo Geo Pocket Color before, but because the GameForce Qi kind of pays homage to the Neo Geo Pocket and Color, I really had a fun time testing out those games on this device. And I have no idea how true they are to the feel of the actual original, which I've never actually held in my hands, but all the same, I did have a fun time playing these games on this device. But honestly, where I thought that the GameForce Qi really shines are on those old school Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. Because to me, this device just oozes 1990s and early 2000s nostalgia. I kind of feel like if you just saw someone playing this, say on the subway or something like that, I think your first thought is going to be, oh, this is like some old refurbished system from back in the day. And I don't really get that impression with a lot of the other devices that have been released in the past few years. This one actually does look and feel like a device straight out of the 90s. And a lot of times we talk about how some of these modern handhelds invoke this feeling of nostalgia, but we're really talking about the games that they're displaying on the screen and maybe the feel of the buttons in the hands. But to me, the GameForce Qi goes one step further. The system is basically saying, hey, these games are going to look exactly like you remember them, maybe even a bit better. The feel of the D-pad and the buttons themselves are going to remind you of those old games. And when you're actually holding the device in your hands, you're also going to have just a tiny little teleportation to the 90s as well, because it invokes that one extra step of feeling holistically like something from that era. And I get it, that's a very abstract concept, and it might not be something that's worth buying an entire handheld for, but all the same, I think the developer, whose name is Gao Feng, really nailed that nostalgic feel better than some of those larger Chinese companies can. PlayStation 1 plays great, and you know PS1 plays so well that you can actually just go into the menu hitting Home and X, and then go into Options, and then select the Enhanced Resolution and Enhanced Resolution Speed Hack to upscale your PS1 games to double the resolution. And this will essentially display your PS1 games in a 640 by 480 resolution, and they look great. Now bear in mind, not every single PS1 game is going to play well like this. As you can see with Tony Hawk 2, it's dipping down to sometimes 58 frames per second, which is not something I actually can physically feel when I'm playing the game, but something you might. So I would say experiment with it, see which one works best for you. Some of these really hard games like Tekken 3 might dip down quite a few frames per second. So it may not be a good idea for every single game, but the option's there. Now, talking about Nintendo 64 here, let's talk a little bit about this analog stick. I think it controls just fine, but one of my issues with it is that it feels pretty slick, to the point where I'm feeling like I'm losing a little bit of the grip because my thumb is sliding around a little bit. But after about a day of use, my thumb actually just naturally kind of adapted to it, and it didn't really feel like an issue after that. Now, unfortunately, as much as I appreciate the fact that EmuElec officially supports the GameForce Qi, the gameplay performance of this particular chipset, especially for those harder to play systems like Nintendo 64, has now been eclipsed by other firmwares such as ArcOS. For example, you can see here with F-Zero X, the best performance I could get out of it, even when twiddling around with some of those cores, was about 40 or below frames per second. Now with ArcOS on the same chipset on the 351P, or even using RetroWAS on the RGB10 Max, I can get very close to a full 60 frames per second using those emulators. And because this is the only firmware that's currently available for this device, one thing to keep in mind is your performance on some of these harder to play systems is not going to be as good as it will be on some other systems that run the same chipset. For example, Dreamcast gameplay is very, very good on both ArcOS as well as RetroWAS. But here on EmuElec, it's just crawling because it's still using the original RetroArch cores. Now one quick note while we're talking about Dreamcast, this device actually has two different rumble motors, and they're placed at opposite ends of the case, but as you're holding the device, you're going to feel the rumble basically near the center of the device itself. And it's not a very aggressive rumble feature. I feel like it's definitely less aggressive than something like the RG351P or the RG351V. And I kind of appreciate how subtle it is. I think that the rumble does really enhance your Dreamcast experience, but unfortunately the performance you're going to get on a lot of these systems is not going to be very good at all. In some systems like Sega Saturn, which are kind of sort of playable on something like ArcOS, is just downright unplayable here on EmuElec It's basically a slideshow. And some of these emulators do need a little bit of work as well. So for example, the standalone Nintendo DS emulator, Drastic, the controls on it are all wonky. Up and down are actually done by using left and right and vice versa. And on top of that, the face buttons are not accurately mapped or anything. So what you'll probably end up having to do is plugging in a USB keyboard and then remapping all of the controls using the keyboard. So that's just going to be an extra 5 minutes work, and if you don't have a USB keyboard handy, it's going to be even more of a pain in the butt. PSP performance on this system is okay, it's really not that much worse than any of the other devices. In general, I would just recommend don't have super high expectations when it comes to 3D PSP games. But it's worth the trial and error to see if any of these games will work, although you're probably going to have to use an auto frame skip of 1. Okay, at this point we've looked at the design and we've talked about gameplay performance. Let's start wrapping things up. Let's start with what I like. So number 1, I love the fact that this has a 4x3 display. This is really well suited for retro gaming all the way up through PS1 and beyond. And this is probably one of the most comfortable handhelds that I own. Not something I really expected when I first got it, but the moment I put it in my hands I was like, it clicks. And it's probably very apparent at this point, but this device has a unique design. I like that it stands out from my other devices. Now whether or not this is going to be the one and only device I buy, I'm not really sure about that part. And another thing I wasn't expecting is just how dang sturdy this device is. It's easily the most sturdy of the plastic devices that I own. I love the fact that this device feels like it's straight out of the late 90s and early 2000s. And not just that it kind of reminds you of it, but it actually does feel like it comes from that time frame. I'm a fan of these big chunky shoulder buttons, and I like the fact that they don't have a lot of travel to them. They just feel really nice and sturdy. This is perfect speaker placement to me because it doesn't get covered up by any of your fingers, and I love that the speakers are firing directly at you as you're playing. And finally, hats off to the developer for making a completely open source device and getting official Emulex support. I really wish that more Chinese device makers were more transparent in the way they make these devices, and then allowing the open source development community to chip in and enhance the device even further. Okay, we've talked about what I like, let's talk about some of the things I don't like about this device. Now number 1, not a huge knock against the device in particular because it had a lot of delays in getting developed, but it is running the aging RK3326 chipset, and I think that's going to be eclipsed by the end of 2021. So it's just really unfortunate that this came out so late in this chipset's lifecycle. And this one's also not a huge hit against the device itself, but just in comparison to other devices, it's really unfortunate that this device doesn't have an OCA laminated display, because I think it would have pushed it even further into being one of my favorite devices. And from a performance standpoint, it's really unfortunate that these face buttons are not perfect. They stick out too much from the case, they're too wobbly, and that combination together makes it a very uncomfortable playing experience, especially if you need to push 2 buttons at once. And finally, a fourth negative, just because I needed to have a fourth one in here to balance everything out, I actually wish that the device had clickable L3 and R3 buttons, but I think the number 1 and 2 function buttons on the bottom left can do that job just fine as well. Okay, so wrapping things up here, what do I really think about this device? Well, I think it's ugly, I think the design choices are just audacious, but at the same time, it's just super fun and I'm growing to like it more and more every day. I definitely think the screen is holding me back from liking it as much as I would, and these wobbly buttons are really going to prevent me from enjoying it to the full extent possible. So yeah, surprise surprise, there are issues with this device and it's not perfect. But no device is. For example, the RG351V, which is also one of my favorite devices, feels a little bit cramped in the hands, and only has a mono speaker and a single analog stick. So that one's got issues too, as great as it is. And one of my other current favorites, the RGB10 Max, has a beautiful 16:9 5-inch display. But the display itself actually wants to pop out all the time because they used a bad glue when they were putting it together. And this also has a mono speaker when it clearly should have had stereo. So all in all, like I was saying, none of these devices are perfect. But they each kind of have a special place in my heart. And now the GameForce Qi has its own space as well. To me, this is a device that basically time traveled over from the late 90s into my hands here in 2021. And while it may not be the most powerful device in my arsenal, and it definitely has its own share of issues, this is the device that most closely resembles that feeling of playing a game back in the late 90s, which I never actually really did because I didn't own any of those devices back in the day. So just shy of buying one of those original devices and then modding the heck out of it to get all the things I want inside of it, I think the GameForce Qi is a close second to that. And that might be something worth considering if you're in the market to adding something to your collection. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.